All right, it's 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time in New York. Welcome to our webinar about scenario analysis and decision making in uncertain times. With me, I have my colleague and friend, Johan Persson, and I will let him in very soon. So before we do that, we will do some warm-up. And we also wait for another couple of hundred people signing in. It's signing in at the speed of light. It's increasing. That's wonderful to see. We have people from all over the world joining in this call. So before we jump into our slide, I would like actually to launch a poll. So please, everybody, jump in and click in. What major changes do you foresee happening due to the situation we are in right now? So just click on it and post submit. Now it's increasing on new way of working online. All right, what do we have more? More on the new way of working online. All right, more, let's see, supply chain is going up here, and new and more competitors. We have, oh, it's very interesting. We have increased speed of innovation is climbing pretty quick. Yeah, it's more increased speed of innovation and more and more. Oi. This is fantastic. And now we have new way of working online. More, less global and more increased speed of innovation. We have revised purpose of the organization is climbing up now. So let's keep it up for another few seconds. So please go in and vote, and I will share the polls with you before we head into the presentation. All right, let's see here. We have a few more coming in. Let it come in, guys. Just vote, submit. All right. So we stop here now, and we share the results with all of you. And as you can see, it is speed of innovation is crucial, and new way of working online. That's where the votes are. Well, it's not a surprise, but it's quite interesting to see. Less global, yeah. Disrupted supply chain, yeah, most likely. So what we will do now is actually to jump into the presentation. So Johan, could you go to the next slide, please? We have today on the call, we have quite many people working for government and for states around the world. We have quite much around consulting, and then we have financial services and manufacturing. So next slide, please. So what we will do today is that we will walk through how to work with scenarios. And Johan will guide you, and at the end of the call, I will take a few questions. You can also post in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and I will try to moderate it. And we will jump into decision making, how to do that, how to work with scenario analysis, and give an example from a space client we worked with, and then also have the Q&A session at the end. So next slide, please, John. Today we see a tremendous critical disruption. We normally show this slide, and we did it way before the Corona pandemic. So the thing is that it's not hard to foresee that we would have a pandemic or a global warming or mass pollution. All of these things is actually known that might hit us. And the effect is quite brutal. So the thing is, how do we organize for that? And we have a call around that the 13th of April. This call will actually be more about understanding different scenarios before you organize for them. So next slide, please, John. A good friend of mine, a Hollywood screenwriter, he always say that it's only two stories in the world, basically. The first story is, next slide, please, is that a stranger comes to town, or you go on a journey. And the question is, are you the victim or the guy in control? And that is exactly what scenario analysis is about. So next slide, please, John. The thing here is that how can we go on a journey if it's cloudy? Well, scenario analysis and what we call pest analysis is few of the tools that is really doable and workable. So next slide, please, John. All right. What we will be focusing on right now is short-term decision making and long-term scenarios. So that's basically what we will be doing. Next slide, John. And now we'll jump into decision making, and I will leave over to Johan. So, Johan, take it away.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you everyone for showing up to this webinar. So, when we talk about decision making, essentially you will always be in one of three kinds of systems. So you have ordered systems that we can then divide into obvious and complicated, and then we have complex and chaotic systems. So if we're talking about obvious situations, that could, for instance, be like an operating theater where a surgeon does a number of operations on patients, and he has a checklist where he can check off that he does things in the right order, and anyone and everyone can understand what he needs to be doing. Obviously, you need a lot of training to do that, but you can see how it works. Then you have complicated situations and systems. So that could be something like finding new mineral rights. It's a cause and effect situation, but you really need to be an expert to handle that type of situation. Further on, you have complex situations, which is where cause and effect really breaks down. You don't have as much control over it. You can only find cause and effect really in hindsight. And examples of this is perhaps wars or even markets. You could also think about, if you work with structured innovation, you have complex situation happening. Then you have chaos, which is when everything really breaks down. There's no cause and effect at all anymore. We're talking 9/11 type situations, and of course where we are now, which is the corona crisis. And then finally you have disorder, which is a situation where you don't really know or understand which of these four situations you're in. And it's quite common to be in that type of situation. So to handle this, there's a framework called Cynefin, and it's a Welsh word because the man who invented this is from Wales. And there you can learn how you can act in these different situations. So if you have an obvious situation, you have something happen, you sense it, and then since this is very ordered, you can categorize it, and then once you categorize it, you can respond. That means essentially that you can have a checklist. So anything that shows up, you can have a checklist and you see, okay, according to the checklist, we do this, and then we respond. So very ordered and very practical. In a complicated situation, it's a bit more complicated to understand the cause and effect. So you first sense you have a problem, you do deep analysis and projections to understand what the response should be. And the difference between these two things is that in the ordered state, you can have best practice. Whereas in the complicated state, you can only have good practice because there's usually a number of ways to reach your goals. And since you have experts dealing with this, you should let them use their expertise. Now, in a complex situation, you can't see cause and effect anymore. So this means you need to work in a different way. So you need to probe the system in a way that doesn't change it too much. Once you have probe and you've gotten some data, you can sense, and then you can respond. Here, you don't even know what good practice is. So the only thing you can ever do is have emerging practices as you understand the situation better. And then you have the chaotic situation where you just have to act, and then you got to respond. And here you only have novel practices. Essentially, you have to stem the bleeding of something. So if you are now in disorder, the problem is that you will always act to what you usually do. So if you're in an obvious, used to being in an obvious situation, let's say you're in a bureaucratic role, it's usually that you feel that there's a problem of your processes. If you're in a complicated mode, usually most of the time, you're a deep expert, you just feel like there's not enough time to do proper analysis. Complex, you're usually like a battle general. You just ask the opinions of a number of people and come up with the right solution, which is usually a good strategy. But if you're somewhere else, it's very inefficient. And then chaotic, it comes with the control freaks, and you just want to tell everyone how to do. So be aware that this is the kind of bias you will always have. So how do you actually work with Cynefin? So first you need to understand your responses, according to the previous slide. You have to remember that you're most often in the disordered state, and you should also remember that you can use complex and chaotic situations to drive innovation. Because in chaotic and complex situation, you have way less inertia and way less resistance to change in your organizations. So some examples of that is, for instance, in 1975, you had a big crisis, you had a big crisis in the world, and a company that came out of that crisis is actually Microsoft. So what you see there is their first BASIC that they made for the Altair. In 2001, Apple was in a crisis, as was the rest of the IT industry. But out of that crisis, they were able to innovate and create the iPod, which then formed the basis for Apple as we have it today. And you even see it now, where you have Chinese companies in the cosmetic sector that have moved all their sales online, and they use online services such as Taobao to do virtual sales. And they've actually been able to increase their year-on-year sales figures in this very deep crisis, especially in China. So it's possible to really benefit from chaos if you're ready and you're willing to act. So if we look at some data from InnoSurvey, which is our database with 5,000 plus companies and their innovation results, if we look at an average company compared to the top innovators in the database, top innovators really have a lot better handle on decision making. And that will really help you in a chaotic situation, such as the one we are in right now. So, scenarios, if we look at longer term, scenarios in general is just a story or a story outline. You use scenarios to investigate possible futures. So you're somewhere now, and you know that the world will change, and it will change in certain directions, and you have to figure out where it is. So it's sort of like a sandbox of the future. A little backstory on it is that it started in the 1940s with the Rand Corporation in the US, where a co-worker there started creating these little stories around how the foreign powers would be starting to use nuclear weaponry in different ways. And over time, that became scenarios. And this was built out over a long time, over the 50s and 60s, and it became very numerical and very analytical. So it was bound to go down in obscurity, but then it was sort of rescued by a large corporation. And that large corporation is Shell. So Shell's claim to fame when it comes to scenario analysis is especially in 1972. So they started this practice in 1970. In 1972, they predicted the oil crisis, where it was actually quite known in the oil business that there was a lot of instability in the Gulf. But most companies didn't react to it. But Shell did, due to their scenario analysis. And they came out of that crisis very strong. So they were able to then come out even stronger after an oil crisis that was connected to the Iran revolution. Then in the 80s, there was a boom, and everyone was just doing M&A and building out the capacity. But according to scenario analysis, a crash was going to happen, which then Shell adopted to, and they were then able to avoid consolidation. So we were talking about 7 sisters in the oil industry that became 3. So they've had a lot of benefit from this practice. Then in the 1990s, essentially they had boiled this all down to a recipe for how to succeed. And it comes down to doing this as a continuous practice and examining the outside world continuously. And Shell has continued to do that. So at this point in time, or the last 10 years, they've been at the forefront of the green shift, going from an oil company to a energy company. And they are continuously using scenario analysis to avoid these big hiccups in the world. So, how do you do it, Magnus? We can't hear you, Magnus. So,
thank you. All right. Give me a second, and I will put on my camera here. So, can you all hear me? Perfect. All right. What the starting point here is to understand the key drivers. So we deal with an uncertain situation where we have potential scenarios, but they are impacted by key drivers. And those key drivers could be political, economical, social, technological, legal, environmental, or demographical. And the idea here is to understand in what way do they impact? Do they impact negatively or positively? And do they impact a little or do they impact a lot? So by mapping these key drivers, you will have a pretty good idea about how to sandboxing the scenarios, basically. So this is on a very high level. Normally, we recommend to do key drivers on an international level and on a local level, and sometimes several local levels. And that way you get a pretty good idea what you have to cope with. So back to you, John.
So in order to exemplify this, we're going to run through a little case that is loosely based on one of our customers. So what we're going to look at here is what we call satellite company. So they're a mid-sized industrial company. They manufacture subcomponent for the space industry, especially. They are considered a high-quality supplier. And in this business where you send very expensive equipment on very expensive rockets up to space, high quality and lack of failure is really a key competitive factor. Should also be noted that the space industry as it stands today is using advanced technology, but it's really quite conservative since there are so large costs concerned with sending things to space that you don't want to test something on the edge. You want it to really be safe when you send it up. So when we build a scenario for a company or an organization, we need to first try and define what are we going to use this scenario for. And you can use it for a number of different things. So if you're a country or something like that, you can use it for policy or strategy. The same goes if you're a private organization, you can use it for strategy or your innovation strategy or your product portfolio ramp up or whatever it might be. But you need to decide before you do. Because what you're going to do with the scenario will decide what analysis are you actually going to do at the end of the day. You also need to define a time horizon, and that's typically at least 5 years, and more likely something like 10 to 20, and sometimes up to 50 years. It depends a little bit on the time, how time moves in your situation. So if you're a very fast-moving startup, or if you're a state, you can have really different impact from how fast time moves. So let's investigate how satellite company can adapt to the current disruptive situation they're facing. So to create a scenario, we go through 5 steps. The first is collect. Second is prioritize and categorize what we collected. Then we extend and combine and develop and use. So we'll go through each step here quite fast and see how we do it. So if we start with collect, as Magnus was saying, we can work with PestLed here to look at the macro drivers in the world. In order to get a feeling for what's most pressing for your organization, you can use something called 7 questions. If you're mostly concerned about how technology moves and the strategy, you can also do value chain maps to see how your specific business will evolve. So we're going to go through Populate in 7 questions here. Just to mention, like a little plug here, Innovation 360 is actually launching the first collaborative macro driver library in the world at some point in the May. We call it Populate 360. So hit us up if you're interested in knowing more about that. So if we look at the Populate canvas for satellite company, if we think in political terms, we believe that government support is going to happen. It's going to be important for us because this is the space business is funded by the governments a lot, most of the time. World security is going to be important for us. Russia and China has impact on the space industry, so we need to have a look at that. If we look at economical, there's a large number of satellite clusters being built at the moment, and at least one of them has recently gone bust, and there are earlier examples of that too, from Iridium around the turn of the millennium that also went bust. There's an economic slowdown happening, and overall there are low interest rates in the world. Socially, we obviously have the COVID-19 happening at the moment. There's also a mission to Mars, which we could also put somewhere else perhaps, but it's ran by SpaceX. On the technology front, a lot of change is actually happening in this industry. So there's rocket reuse from SpaceX, which is decreasing launch costs. There's the satellite clusters that I was mentioning before, both OneWeb, which was an Airbus initiative. There's one from SpaceX as well. Open source is affecting all technology. If you look a bit further ahead, there's space mining of asteroids. And you also have Moore's law that is slowing down for computing, but some of the effects there are really impacting some of the components that you use in the space industry. If you look at legal, there's talk about United Nations regulation around the space market. It's quite unclear how any space resources in the future, how they will be claimed. Environmentally, there's environmental surveillance, given the green awakening that we see. How will that impact? There's global dimming that we don't know if we can do something about, and there's space junk that can be a big detrimental factor in the space industry. And demographically, there's the third world where you don't have a well built out infrastructure, but which could be solved by satellite communication, possibly. There's massive online courses. That means that people from the third world with gets access to really high quality education and can possibly be a future workforce. And there's population growth all over the world, in some cases exponential, and in some cases in Western countries, there's actually population slowing, so there's migration happening. So how does this affect us? So you can collect a large number of macro factors. In order for this version of scenario development to be feasible in a short time, you have to limit yourself. There are a large number of ways you can develop scenarios, but the one we're showing you now, you have to limit yourself and really prioritize. So a way to do that is to look at what's called 7 questions. So this is something that was developed by Shell, and the basis of it is essentially asking people in your organization, if you got to ask someone from 10 years from now about something, what would you ask them? And then you ask several follow-up questions to that. And when that's done on the satellite company, they essentially answer 2 things. They want to know about the satellite clusters, and they want to know about the decreased launch costs from reusability of rockets. So we've now collected some information and some drivers. We now have to prioritize and categorize them. So the way we categorize them is on 2 axes. So the first is it important or unimportant to us? And are we certain about the effects here, or are we uncertain? So to do this development, you can work in a number of ways. You could just vote internally, but you could also do more deep analysis, which is probably a more thorough thing to do, where you look at how do these different trends and macro factors impact each other. And you can then see there are going to be certain trends that are just being impacted by everything else. So they can work as an indicator of what's going on. And there are going to be certain macro factors that really is a strong impactor on everything. And that can help you prioritize and put things in certain and uncertain, in important or unimportant. You then have to understand whether you think it's uncertain or certain. What we're going to build scenarios around is the uncertain and important macro trends. So if we look at satellite company here, we see that the world security situation is impacting quite a lot of things, as do the economic slowdown, as do COVID-19. We see that satellite clusters is really being impacted by loads of factors, as is environmental surveillance. And by doing this, you can essentially understand where we should prioritize. So we already know that the organization is mostly worried about rocket reuse and satellite cluster. And rocket reuse, we can see here, is really a strong driver of what's going on in the space industry, as satellite company sees it. So, having done that analysis, we can place the macro drivers we've chosen to work with in our little matrix. And we see that government support, cluster busts, and open source are considered certain because cluster busts have already happened. We don't know what's going to happen with the remaining clusters, but yeah. We see that we're sure that young population for internet, essentially the third world infrastructure, we know that that's going to happen, but it's not important to our market right now, and neither is global dimming. What is uncertain but unimportant is the environmental surveillance. We don't think that that has impact on our business, as is UN regulation around space. We're just going to have to follow it like everyone else. And then there's the Russia and China question, which is important in a way, but it won't affect our business. So what we will use to start to look at building scenarios around is rocket reuse, COVID-19, satellite clusters, and the world security situation. So the next step is to extend these macro drivers to understand where is the uncertainty, where are the endpoints of uncertainty. So we need to stretch the trend in different ways. So if we look at the world security situation, for instance, we can say and find a number of variations on that theme. So in this case, we can look at what this means. So the world security situation could be that the world is insecure and unstable, or the world is secure and stable. Then if you dive down a bit, you can see and look at terrorism is a continuing global issue, or it's actually handled by nations. And on that same theme, you can see, are nations closed and protectionistic, or are they open? So you can do that for essentially all the macro drivers. We've chosen here to do it for rocket reuse, satellite clusters, and COVID-19. So here we can see launch is expensive, launch is free, pay per launch, launch as a service, and so on and so forth. So the next step is to combine these things to start to build the basis for our scenarios. So this means we have to prioritize some axes of uncertainty, some of these stretched axes. So we've chosen to prioritize 4 of them here. So we prioritize launch is expensive, closed systems versus open standards, increased need for communication innovation, closed borders, decreased communication needs, and then usage business model and product business model. What you then do is you combine these axes and see, okay, if we have both launches free and open standards, what's going to happen then? We need to build a scenario around that. Or if you have both product business model and closed borders, what does that mean in a scenario? So with only 3 or 4 axis combinations, you get, so if each quadrant here is a possible scenario, you understand that you have to really limit yourself if you're going to work with scenarios in this way, because you're going to do a lot of scenario development. which you can do in a fast way, which we will show you, or you can do it in a detailed way, and then you have to be even more selective. So in this case, we're going to actually develop a scenario for the combination of a user's business model and open standards. So what will that look like? So to understand what this scenario is, we have to do a few things. So we have to understand what the world and the market is in this scenario. And to do that, we use 6 forces, which we will show you later. We need to understand what our company is like. We, in this case, will investigate what the business model will be. We need to summarize what the direction of change is for our company. So we stand somewhere right now, and we see a future somewhere. How is it going to change to get there? Once we've developed that base for our scenario, we need to make a timeline to understand what happens when and what drives us towards this scenario. We need to make up a catchy name, figure out what the main recommendations are, write a scenario description or make a scenario movie or whatever it might be to communicate and to have your organization understand. And then we need to build strategic initiatives from the scenario, depending on what the result is. So 6 forces is a variation of 5 forces where we also take in collaboration into account. So we look at the rivalry in the market. We look at the bargaining powers of buyers, threat to new entrants, bargaining power of suppliers, and threat of substitutes. So the key findings for us in a quick analysis here is that if we have decreased capex needs, probably new entrants will have a bigger chance of entering our market in the future. So, and in this case, with the open standards and the user's business model, we think that new startups can start to build on these platforms, and that will be new entrants. Again, with the standardized offer, you can probably see that key expertise in the space market will be reduced, the value of it will be reduced to some degree. So that means that big companies with expertise in advanced electronics, such as Bosch, could also be entrants. With the open standards too, you have commoditization, and that means that the buyer power will increase. Of course, you can do this to a much larger degree, but for a quick analysis, this still gives us some insight. So the next step is to understand then, okay, what's the business model? And that's done via the business model canvas. And usually you can think of this as you have a customer that you're gonna give some form of value to. You do that, you find a customer and you give him value through channels, and you have some sort of relationship with this customer to keep him around. This creates revenue streams. To deliver the value proposition, you need key activities, and you use key resources to perform those key activities, and you have partners to help you out. And that results in a cost structure. So if we look at the business model canvas now for a satellite company, you have governments and communications companies, because they do communication satellites. They build satellites, advanced systems essentially, that is quite difficult to do. They win their business a lot by tenders, and their companies, they pay per satellite, more or less. Their relationship to these customers is essentially institutional, because they've been there for a very long time. A key activity is quality assurance. It's essentially making sure that the satellite, if it makes it to space via the launch, is really going to work. And they have a number of patents that really makes them stand out. And then they have suppliers of these advanced systems. And the cost comes out from really long specialized dev projects, because each satellite is more or less unique. In this new world, they're going to actually serve major corporations and probably new data startups that use new cheap satellites to create new interesting services to the market. With the new commoditization of platforms, they're going to actually try and do a marketplace. So that's going to be possible now when the service is much easier to sell. Essentially, the Alibaba of space, something like that. And they're going to have to build a community with these startups in the future. Their value proposition is to build this open platform that we foresee, and essentially open sourcing that platform. And then they're going to add specialized add-ons for extra revenue that they can build together with these startups. So that means that they have to build a market, build a platform, and a capability to be fast. A key resource will be a network of these new startups, and they need relationships with them. So the revenue will be pay-per-use for the services in space, and then their costs will change to standardized production and new customer acquisitions costs for their marketplace. So it's going to be quite a different future in this scenario for satellite company. So to summarize that and to make it clearer, you can use blue ocean strategy. So in the blue ocean strategy, you can look at what's called a value curve for what's important in your specific market, and see what are you going to strengthen, what are you going to reduce, what are you going to remove, and what are you going to create in your offering. So in this case, we need to really increase our speed of development. We need to increase standardization to build the platform. We need to reduce quality assurance, because with cheaper launch costs, it's going to happen that speed is more important than absolute massive quality. We have to standardize more, so we don't want to do unique design elements anymore. We're going to essentially remove the tender activity, because that's not where the growth is going to be in the future. And we have to create the marketplace, this network of startups, and this open platform in the future. So we're going to amply name this, not very without much imagination, to platform and marketplace. And we are going to make a timeline where we think that in roughly 2 years, we're going to be able to start to see standards defined for interfaces in satellites. 5 years later or 6 years later, we're going to see either us or other people open source some base technology. And then shortly after that, we're going to see a community of developers use the platform. And even later after that, we see that a marketplace will open. And to build a story around this, we can have a number of narratives, or you can build a video, or you can write longer stories. But it's quite useful to have short ones. So in this case, satellite company talk about satellite Lego, where you have small pieces that you can build together into a system. You have the space supermarket, where people can buy services from these standardized platforms. And you have new small startups that can use the platform for new inventive things. So that means MacGyver in space, where you can, with a much cheaper mode of operation, that becomes possible. So that's one scenario for a satellite company. So what you do now, of course, is you can't base your strategy on just one scenario. So you need to do this for a lot more macro factors, and to run and for a number, and create a number of scenarios. Once that's done, you can start to see, are the recommendations kind of similar for some of these scenarios? Is there a kernel of something in these scenarios that we can use to build strategy that we can, so in such a way that we can prepare for uncertainty? So if we think of the satellite company here, if we decide that we're going to build this type of platform strategy, almost regardless of what's going to happen to the industry, we're probably going to be able to decrease costs and increase agility for most future scenarios by doing that. We just have to make a decision. And if we want to create a network of startups, if possible, even if the whole open source space Lego situation doesn't happen, it can be a competitive advantage to us, even if open source and the cluster idea fails. So that's just from doing one scenario, we can find out, okay, there's a kernel in here that can be useful for strategy for us. So to actually develop the strategy, we need to look at a number of things. So what we've done here is essentially the external outlook. Doing the PES-led analysis, building the scenarios, is looking at the external world. What are opportunities and threats in the external world? And that's all good, but we have to figure out, okay, out of these opportunities and threats, what can we do about them? So that means you need to figure out what capabilities do we have for innovation. So we're doing an innovation strategy here, so innovation is going to be the important factor. So and by doing an innovation assessment, that's something we can find out. So now we have we've defined an opportunity space where we see, okay, we have opportunities and threats that we can attack and protect ourselves from due to our capabilities. Now we have to align what we're going to do with a purpose and vision and mission. We need to figure out, okay, do we have a corporate strategy already? What does that say? We want to support that with our innovation strategy. Then we have goals for innovation. And this could be, for instance, how much growth do we want to see? So we have customers that have said, okay, we want to grow from 17 billion to 24 billion in 6 years. One of those billions is going to be from internal organic innovation. So that's a very straight up innovation goal. And our risk profile in our innovation strategy need to reflect what that goal is. And then we do more or less the same type of work we did for the scenario, where we look at, okay, how is our business model going to change given all these opportunities and threats and this filter for what we want to do. And to execute the innovation strategy, we need strategic initiatives. And the strategic initiative, we typically try to understand, okay, which growth horizon is this about? Is this about our core business? Is this about growth business for us? Or is this about new options that we want to create? And what type of innovation is it? Is it product? Is it platform? Is it business model innovation? Is it some change to our organization? Because obviously, when you do the strategic initiatives, it can either be business alternatives, so we create new business, or it could be some form of change that needs to happen in our organization in order to capitalize on opportunities or protect ourselves from threats. So we know here that we need capabilities for platform, and we need the leadership style called Pac-Man, which is working with startups and giving out little dots to them that they eat, and then we come and eat them up if they work out. We need to figure out who is going to sponsor this in our organization. We need to figure out who's responsible for executing, and we need to write some sort of description so that people understand what we're doing and why. Once we have our strategic initiatives, usually when you have a strategy, you can't start to do everything at the same time. So you need to make some sort of prioritization. And a pretty straightforward and simple way of doing that is to plot an impact versus feasibility graph. And you can score your strategic initiatives in different ways. Either you have a scoring method, or you just put them up. You put something in the middle, and then you place other things in relation to that. And this will depend on how much time you have and what your organization look like. And once you've done that, you can see, okay, things that have very high feasibility and very high impact. That's easy quick wins. So that's something you can start with in your innovation strategy. Once you've got that going and you have some innovation happening, you should probably do something with high impact and a bit lower feasibility, because that could really be, since the feasibility is low, it's probably hard to copy and give you some competitive advantage. It's also, if it's relatively infeasible, it probably means that the impact is a bit more uncertain as well, which means that the impact can be higher than we appreciate in the graph. And then sometimes, obviously, you find things down in the left corner where it's very low impact and the feasibility is very low, and you should figure out, okay, do we really want to do this? So that you can maybe pause and do something else with. So you then have a starting point to start act and get on with your life. And once you've done that, you've actually stepped through the whole cycle, and you've probably cleared the clouds to some degree. So Magnus.
All right. Thank you. So, wonderful, Johan. Let's see if we can give me in the picture here or not. Well, we go ahead without the picture. Thank you. So you now have the tools to start the journey and actually start to happen to the world, and not vice versa. So I guess that if you just give me a second here, I think that I can find a way of getting up on the screen. So now I'm up on the screen. So hello, everybody. So now you have the tools to start to happen to the world. I would also like to comment before we jump into the Q&A that it's not just about feasibility, it's actually what could be feasible. So when we do our innovation assessments, basically assessing the culture, the capability, the leadership and the structure for innovation and innovation management, and also the underlying competences when that's relevant, that is actually giving you a hunch or a hint what gaps to be closed. And then you can put very precise measure on it and move it basically from like an intuition to something very tangible, put up transformation plans, to how to close the gaps, to be able to make something very little unfeasible, making that actually quite feasible. So that way you can actually move up in the quadrant and very strategically claim a position that other might not be able to claim. So that's a little bit how it goes together. So what we will do now, if you go to the next slide, Johan, we will have a small Q&A session. And the easiest way to do that is if you just post the question in the chat, or if you like to in the Q&A. So let's go to the next slide. While you're thinking about the questions you might want to post to us, we have a few more minutes to go. It's a lot of people that have been asking for if you can license yourself. Yes, we have a license program for clients. We call that corporate partner program. And we have a license program for consultancy firm all over the world. And a good number of you guys are on this call as well. It's a partner program for consultancy firms where you can accreditate yourself. And you can work anything from independent to in the large firms. And we have a good number of partners around the world in 45 countries. And then we have specific programs for universities. And I know a good number of you are on this call as well. So we have education partners, corporate partners, and consultancy partners. And to be that, you need to have a certain number of accredited people. So that way we create a collaborative way of working. So we also work directly with clients, just like our partners, and we team up to form teams very quickly, working across the whole world, basically. So that's a little bit about the question that I know that a few of you posted directly to me here. So let's see if we have any questions here. And I'm happy to take questions around the methodology, or I pass it over to Johan. So let's see if we have any questions here. All right, it's just to shoot the question. If everyone had a question, we had quite many questions here during the call. Yeah, I have one question here. If you can use scenario analysis for social impact. Yes, you can. Scenario analysis could be done for mapping anything. And we did quite much work together with the UN around sustainability, and it's very applicable for that. So it's actually to foresee a potential future, like creating a picture and working from there and see how can you organize to respond to that future, basically. Is there any more questions? I'm happy to take them right now, or if I post them over to Johan while we're waiting for questions. What we can assist you with, guys, except from the accreditation programs, is to kickstart innovation, which is obviously pretty interesting right now because we have to deal with a new world. Also training in decision making, and I actually got a question there about decision making. So the question is, how do you make decision when you don't know? Yeah, that's the whole point. That actually, the thing is that by preparing yourself, like Sun Tzu in the tent 4,000 years ago, for many scenarios, you might be able actually to do a better decision. But it's not just about that in the scenarios. It's also about the quantifying decisions with probability and with uncertainty. And based on that, you can go ahead. Now I got another question. Is there possible to see the 5 steps again? What you could do is you can, after this session, reach out and we can provide with certain parts of the presentation. So if you send an email afterwards, we can make sure to share a little bit of that. Another question here. Great work. How do you see a fast version of the methodology working to revisit the company now in crisis? I find Blue Ocean excellent. Yeah, so Blue Ocean is one way of doing it, and we use that. This is a very fast way of working, actually. But just jumping into Blue Ocean will not really do, because it's not enough. You need to understand the circumstances around. Otherwise, you need to populate the metrics with things that you don't know. So the idea here is actually to create that space with a possible potential outcome and use that and Blue Ocean. And based on that, go ahead. But my advice is also to combine it with ideation and hackathons. We do online hackathons in 48 hours to collect actually input for the Blue Ocean metrics. Are you planning an online course? Yeah, we have accreditations online. And again, you can go to the Lysis site. You just got it here in the chat now. You will have a possibility to get in contact, and every material is there. Can you speak on how the Innovation 360 assessment can feed into scenario process? Yes, of course. I'm happy to. So the thing is that when you understand the key drivers and then you see potential futures, then you have to ask yourself, what can I be in these potential futures? And to answer that question, the feasibility, you need to understand yourself. An Innovation 360 assessment about your capability, structure, culture, leadership, and strategy for responding to change. And if you understand that, you can see what's feasible and not feasible. And based on that, you can basically carve out the transformation program to close gaps and be more responsive and take a position to do something less feasible that will create a competitive advantage. And you can also link that to strategic initiatives. So you will have strategic initiatives, you will have your organization as such and what you can do, and you have the scenarios. And based on that, you can find out, this is the initiative I would like to work with. This is how I need to adapt in the speed of light in my organization, and you have to. If you don't have the leadership and the culture, it will block anything. And then a Blue Ocean strategy is meaningless, basically. You need to have the leadership and the culture and the capability in place to do it. Otherwise, it will be blocked. Sign up for the 13th of April. We will talk about the top 5 blockers and how that's hindering or helping you. So you need to remove the blockers. Otherwise, it's absolutely meaningless to do all these exercises. So the assessment is about understanding the blocker, remove them, adapt doing something less feasible to be feasible, link that to strategic initiatives, and kickstart ideation processes to get more ideas and sort it out.